What happens between you and an avoidant partner in physical intimacy is not a mystery. It feels like one. It feels like something beyond explanation, something that exists outside the normal categories of experience, something that your rational understanding of the relationship cannot account for. You know, intellectually, that the dynamic is not fully working. You can see the pattern. You can name the inconsistency. You can describe with some accuracy what the distance costs you. And then the physical closeness happens and none of that analysis feels relevant anymore. The body responds in ways that override the conclusions the mind has been carefully building. And afterward, the hold of the connection feels stronger rather than weaker, more difficult to walk away from rather than easier, more central to your experience rather than more resolved. There are specific reasons for this: neurological reasons, psychological reasons, reasons grounded in how the avoidant dynamic specifically interacts with the brain's reward systems to produce an experience that functions more like a substance than like ordinary intimacy. Understanding those reasons does not make the experience less real, but it does change what the experience means, and that change in meaning is the beginning of the only thing that actually helps. Let me start with the neurochemistry, because the addictive quality is not metaphorical. It is literally operating through the same neurological mechanisms as other forms of addiction. Physical intimacy releases oxytocin. This is the bonding hormone, the one that produces the felt sense of attachment, of connection, of trust toward the person you are with. It is released during physical closeness, and it does something specific in the brain. It strengthens the attachment to the source. It increases the felt significance of the person who was present during the release. It makes them feel, on a neurological level, more important, more central, more connected to your sense of safety and well-being. In a consistently available relationship, this oxytocin release contributes to a stable and deepening bond. The attachment strengthens gradually, and the person you are bonding with remains consistently present, so the bond has somewhere reliable to anchor. In the avoidant dynamic, the oxytocin release happens, and then the person withdraws. The bonding response was activated, the attachment was strengthened, and then the source of the attachment becomes unavailable again, which activates the attachment system's distress response, which produces the anxiety and the preoccupation and the increased focus on the unavailable person that the attachment system generates when the attachment figure withdraws. The cycle of closeness and withdrawal, repeated with physical intimacy, amplifying the bonding response each time, produces an escalating attachment that has very little to do with the quality or sustainability of the relationship, and almost everything to do with the neurochemical cycle the dynamic creates. This is not love becoming deeper. This is the brain's reward and bonding systems being activated and then frustrated in a pattern that produces the same neurological signature as addiction: wanting more, thinking about it constantly, finding that ordinary experiences feel flat by comparison, returning despite the cost. Dopamine is the second neurochemical worth understanding here, and its role is, if anything, more central to the addictive quality than oxytocin. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical, not strictly the pleasure chemical, as it is often described, the anticipation of reward, the reaching towards something that might be good. And what the research on dopamine shows, consistently and clearly, is that the dopamine system responds most powerfully not to consistent reward, but to uncertain reward, to the possibility that this time the thing you want will be available, to the specific neurological charge of not knowing whether the warmth will be there or whether the distance will have returned. The avoidance inconsistency is, from the dopamine system's perspective, a perfectly calibrated uncertainty machine. Each interaction contains the genuine possibility of the warmth and the genuine possibility of the withdrawal. And that uncertainty, that specific not knowing whether this will be the closeness or the distance, activates the dopamine system at a level that consistent availability never produces. This is why the physical intimacy with an avoidant can feel more intense than physical intimacy in more consistent relationships. Not because the connection is deeper, because the uncertainty is higher, because the dopamine system is more activated by the not knowing, because the relief of the closeness arriving after the uncertainty of whether it would produces a neurological reward that is amplified by the uncertainty that preceded it. You are not addicted to the person, you are addicted to the neurochemical cycle the dynamic produces. That is a meaningful distinction, not one that makes the experience less real, one that locates what is actually happening accurately. Beyond the neurochemistry, there is a psychological layer that the physical intimacy adds to the avoidant dynamic, something that operates through meaning rather than through neurochemicals, something that makes the physical closeness feel like evidence of something the rest of the relationship does not provide clearly. When the avoidant who maintains emotional distance becomes physically close, the physical closeness gets read as access to the real person, as the proof that the connection is what you sensed it was, as the moments when the walls come down and what exists underneath them is visible, as confirmation. This reading is understandable. In many relational contexts, it would be accurate. Physical intimacy is a form of vulnerability. It does often reflect genuine attachment. But in the avoidant dynamic specifically, it is not always the confirmation it feels like. The avoidant's relationship with physical intimacy is complicated by the same architecture that complicates their relationship with emotional intimacy. Some avoidants find physical closeness easier than emotional closeness, less threatening in certain ways, more bounded, more controllable, something that can exist without requiring the sustained vulnerability of genuine emotional availability. This means the physical closeness can occur without representing what you are interpreting it to represent, can be real as a physical experience without being the evidence of emotional access you are reading it as, can leave you feeling more confirmed in the connection, while the avoidant has not actually come closer in the ways that would make the connection genuinely sustainable. The misreading of the physical as confirmation of the emotional is one of the primary mechanisms through which the hold of the avoidant dynamic gets stronger rather than weaker through physical intimacy. You are not wrong that something real is happening. You are potentially misidentifying what that real thing is evidence of. Now, I want to be direct about the unhealthy dimension of this, because the educational framing requires honesty about what the addictive quality actually does to a person over time. An attachment that is primarily maintained through the neurochemical cycle of physical closeness and withdrawal is not a foundation. It is a dynamic. And the dynamic, however intense the experience within it, tends to produce specific and documented effects on the people inside it. The tolerance effect. The same level of closeness produces less of the felt connection over time. More is required to produce the same neurological response. The avoidant's occasional warmth, which initially felt significant, gradually requires more intensity or more frequency to produce the same felt connection, and the avoidance patterns typically cannot provide that escalation, which produces a growing dissatisfaction that is interpreted as the need for more of the avoidant rather than as the tolerance effect of an addictive cycle. The withdrawal effect. Periods of the avoidance distance, which might have been manageable early in the dynamic, become increasingly difficult to tolerate as the addiction deepens. The same distance that once felt like normal relationship fluctuation begins to feel like deprivation, begins to produce the specific anxiety and preoccupation of someone whose neurochemistry has become organized around a source that is inconsistently available. The narrowing effect. Other sources of pleasure and meaning gradually become less activating relative to the avoidant dynamic. The dopamine system, calibrated to the high uncertainty reward of the avoidant's intermittent closeness, finds ordinary consistent pleasures less compelling by comparison. Life outside the dynamic can begin to feel flatter, which creates the pull back toward the dynamic, not because the dynamic is genuinely nourishing, but because it has become the primary source of neurological activation. These are not signs that the connection is uniquely significant. They are signs that the cycle has become addictive in the clinical sense, that the relationship between your neurochemistry and the dynamic has crossed from bonding into dependency. How do you stop it? That is the honest question this script was always building toward, and I want to answer it as specifically as I can, rather than in the vague language of self-care and time that makes healing sound easier than it is. The first thing to understand is that stopping it is neurologically similar to stopping any addictive cycle, which means there will be a withdrawal period, a period during which the absence of the neurochemical activation the dynamic was providing feels like deprivation, like something important is missing, like the world has gone flat. That flatness is not evidence that you made the wrong choice. It is the withdrawal effect, the nervous system recalibrating to function without the specific and intense activation the avoidant dynamic was providing. It is uncomfortable, it is temporary, and mistaking it for evidence that you need to return to the dynamic is one of the primary ways people cycle back in rather than moving through. The second thing is that the neurological recalibration requires new inputs, not as distraction, as the actual restoration of the nervous system's capacity to find ordinary, consistent warmth activating other connections, other sources of meaning and pleasure and genuine reciprocal engagement, not to replace the avoidant, to give the dopamine system something to recalibrate toward, something that does not operate through uncertainty and intermittency, but through the steady and sustainable activation of genuine presence. This takes longer than most people want it to take. The nervous system that has been calibrated to high uncertainty reward does not immediately find consistent warmth as compelling, but with enough exposure, with enough genuine engagement with people and experiences that operate through consistency rather than intermittency, the calibration shifts. The consistent begins to feel nourishing rather than flat. The ordinary begins to feel sufficient rather than inadequate. That shift is the healing. Not a dramatic transformation, the gradual restoration of a nervous system that can find genuine pleasure in what is actually good for it, rather than only in what produces the most intense activation. The first part described the mechanism honestly, the neurochemistry, the dopamine cycle, the misreading of physical closeness as emotional confirmation, the specific effects of the addictive dynamic over time. That foundation matters because understanding what is actually happening is the first requirement for changing it. Now I want to talk about what actually helps, not in the abstract, in the specific, practical, unglamorous texture of what breaking an addictive relational cycle actually requires. The most important thing to say at the start of this part is something that the framing of addiction makes clearer than the framing of heartbreak does. You cannot think your way out of this. Understanding the neurochemistry does not dissolve the neurochemical cycle. Understanding the dopamine system does not stop the dopamine system from producing the pull toward the source of its most intense activation. Understanding that the physical closeness was being misread as emotional confirmation does not immediately stop the body from responding to the memory of it with the same intensity it responded to the original experience. This is important because the people most likely to engage deeply with the psychological framework I described in the first part are people who are intelligent and self-aware and accustomed to using understanding as the primary tool for navigating difficulty. And in many areas of life, understanding is a powerful tool. But in the specific territory of addictive neurological cycles, understanding is necessary, but not sufficient. It tells you what is happening. It does not by itself change what is happening. What changes what is happening is behavior. Specifically, the repeated behavioral choice to not return to the source of the cycle, maintained through the withdrawal period, until the nervous system has had enough time and enough alternative input to recalibrate. That behavioral choice is simple to describe and genuinely difficult to maintain. Because the pull toward the source is neurological, it does not respond to argument. It does not quiet because you have understood it accurately. It simply pulls. And maintaining the behavioral choice in the face of the pull is the actual work. There are specific things that make maintaining that behavioral choice more possible. Not easy, more possible. The first is honesty about what the pull actually is. When the pull toward the avoidant surfaces, the mind tends to dress it in the language of the connection, of the realness of what existed, of the specific and irreplaceable quality of the person, of the moments that were genuine, of the possibility that things could be different. All of that may contain some truth, and it is also the addictive cycle looking for its justification, looking for the framing that makes returning feel like a meaningful choice rather than a neurological pull dressed in the language of love. The honest naming of the pull for what it is, not a verdict on the connection's reality, but an accurate identification of what is generating the pull in this specific moment, creates a small but real space between the pull and the response to it. Not the elimination of the pull, a moment of recognition that allows the behavioral choice to be made deliberately rather than automatically. That moment of recognition is the practice. It does not feel powerful. It does not feel like enough against the intensity of the pull. But practiced repeatedly, it becomes the thing that makes the behavioral choice sustainable. The gap between the pull and the response gradually widens. The automatic quality of the return diminishes. The choice becomes more genuinely a choice. The second thing that makes the behavioral choice more sustainable is what I want to spend the most time on. because it is the one that addresses the actual neurological requirement rather than just the psychological one. Your nervous system needs to experience something other than flatness on the other side of the avoidant dynamic. The flatness is real. The world genuinely feels less activated in the withdrawal period. The dopamine system, calibrated to high uncertainty reward, does not immediately find ordinary, consistent experiences compelling. Other people can feel less interesting. Other pleasures can feel less intense. Other connections can feel like they are operating at a lower voltage than what the avoidant dynamic was producing. Most people, encountering this flatness, interpret it as confirmation that the avoidant was uniquely significant, that nothing will match what existed there, that the connection was special in a way that makes the flatness the honest assessment of everything else, rather than the withdrawal effect of an addictive cycle. This interpretation is almost always wrong, and acting on it, returning to the avoidant because the flatness confirms their uniqueness, resets the neurological cycle, and makes the next withdrawal period longer and more difficult. The actual requirement is to stay in the flatness long enough for the nervous system to begin recalibrating, to introduce, during the flatness, genuine engagement with people and experiences and sources of meaning that operate through consistency rather than uncertainty. Not because they will immediately feel as intense as the avoidant dynamic, because repeated genuine engagement with consistent warmth is the only input that actually restores the nervous system's capacity to find it rewarding. The recalibration is slow, weeks rather than days in most cases, sometimes longer depending on how long the addictive cycle was running and how deeply it calibrated the nervous system's reward expectations. There is no shortcut through this timeline. There is only the staying in it, and the continuing to introduce the alternative inputs, and the trusting that the nervous system's capacity for genuine pleasure in consistent warmth is not permanently damaged, but temporarily recalibrated. It is not permanently damaged. The capacity comes back, slower than you want, more fully than you fear. I want to address something specific about the physical dimension of the breaking that does not get discussed enough. The body holds the memory of the avoidant's physical presence as a specific and located thing, not abstract, embodied. The specific quality of their touch, the specific physical experience of closeness with them, is stored in the nervous system in a way that can be activated by stimuli that carry even partial resemblance to the original experience. A similar physical sensation, a similar smell, a similar quality of physical proximity with someone else. This embodied memory is part of why the pulling back toward the avoidant can feel so urgent and so physical, rather than purely emotional or psychological. The body is not making an emotional argument. It is simply producing the memory of the specific physical experience and the neurochemical response associated with it. Working with this embodied dimension of the cycle requires something that is somewhat different from the cognitive and behavioral work I have described. It requires physical engagement with the body's current experience rather than with the memory. Physical movement. Genuine physical engagement with the present environment, the kind of embodied presence that redirects the nervous system's attention from the stored memory to the current sensory reality. This is not a technique so much as an orientation. The orientation of bringing attention back into the body as it actually is right now, rather than as it was in the memory of the avoidant's presence. Over time, this practice, whatever specific form it takes for you, contributes to the loosening of the embodied memory's hold, not by erasing it, by building present tense embodied experience that is vivid enough to gradually reduce the memory's relative intensity. Let me close this part with something honest about the longer timeline of healing from this specific kind of addictive dynamic. The pull does not disappear on a schedule. Long after you have intellectually processed the relationship, long after you have understood the mechanism and made the behavioral choice and introduced alternative inputs and begun the recalibration, the pull can resurface. Triggered by something unexpected, with an intensity that feels disproportionate to where you are in the healing. That resurgence is not a setback. It is the normal, non-linear pattern of neurological recalibration, encountering the embodied memories that have not yet fully integrated. It does not mean you are back at the beginning. It means the healing is still in process rather than complete. The difference between the resurgence at 6 months and the original pull is not always visible from the inside. From the inside, both feel urgent and real. But from the outside, if you could see your own pattern across time, the resurgences become less frequent and shorter in duration, and less total in their claim on your attention and your behavioral choices. That trajectory is the healing, not a straight line, a direction, and maintaining the direction, returning to it after each resurgence without interpreting the resurgence as evidence that the direction is wrong, is the whole of what the practical work requires. Not perfect execution, the direction maintained imperfectly over time. That is what the healing actually looks like. And it is enough. It is genuinely, completely enough.